They say an outboard never breaks down, but that's not really what they mean. They're not claiming perfection. They're saying it didn't betray them when it mattered. No random alarms halfway across the lake. No weird limp mode that vanishes at the dock. No summer lost while the dealer waits on a part you didn't know existed. And here's the twist. The engines owners swear by aren't always the newest, or the most expensive, or the ones with the loudest marketing. They're the ones with failure modes that make sense. The kind you can predict, prevent, and fix without turning your entire season into a troubleshooting saga. Today, we're counting down 5 Outboards owners call unbreakable. We start where horsepower makes mistakes expensive, drop into a small dealer favorite that rewrites expectations, then finish with heavy hitters that split opinion like nothing else. Because reliability isn't magic, it's patterns. And once you see them, buying decisions get very different. Let's get into it. Mercury Verado 250. It usually starts with expectations that are already high. Nobody buys a motor like this because they are aiming for good enough. They buy it because they want power that feels controlled, comfort that feels deliberate, and that quiet confidence you only notice when it is missing. The outboard feels planted. The boat feels composed. Everything about the experience suggests that the motor is in charge, not constantly fighting the conditions. Then the first real test arrives. Heavy load, hot day, long run, and the question stops being theoretical. Is this the kind of outboard that stays smooth when you stop treating it gently? The Mercury Verado 250 lives in a zone where drama is always nearby, even when nothing is technically wrong. Not because it is fragile, but because the stakes are high. A problem at this level is never just mechanical. It becomes downtime. It becomes dealer dependence. It becomes a phone call, followed by a quote big enough to force uncomfortable decisions. That is exactly why owners who swear by this platform sound different from casual fans. They do not say it is flawless, they say it is consistent. And when they say never breaks down, they are usually saying the outboard does not surprise them when the cost of surprise is highest. The promise behind the Verado name was refined, power smooth, strong, and controlled in a way that feels deliberate rather than aggressive. Owners who stay loyal tend to repeat the same observations. Idle stays stable instead of wandering. Mid-range power feels confident without feeling frantic. The outboard does not behave like it is constantly on edge. That matters because stress and heat are what quietly shorten lives. A motor that can do normal work without always sounding strained often buys itself years without drama. But reputations like this are not built on hardware alone. They are built on systems. Support matters. A platform with wide adoption and a strong service network often feels more reliable because the infrastructure around it works. When a sensor drifts or a component ages out, the solution is usually known. The owner is not stuck, explaining symptoms to multiple shops that have never seen the issue. Familiarity turns problems into procedures instead of mysteries. This is where the stories split. Technology cuts both ways. The same sophistication that makes the experience premium can also make ownership feel dealer-locked if support is weak. Owners with access to experienced service tend to describe years of calm ownership. Owners without that access sometimes describe one small issue turning into a long, expensive wait. The outboard itself did not change. The environment around it did. There is also a psychological trap with engines like this. Because they feel so composed, owners can become casual. Cooling service gets delayed because nothing seems wrong. Fuel quality becomes an assumption instead of a system. Electrical connections get ignored because the outboard still starts. Then one day, the motor does not explode. It whispers. Slightly higher temperature behavior. A change in idle quality. A moment of hesitation under load. Owners who swear by this platform tend to be the ones who listen at that stage instead of clearing alarms and hoping. The grounded takeaway is simple. The Mercury Verado 250 earns loyalty when it is treated like a high-value system, not just a motor. Cooling service stays on schedule. Fuel management is intentional. Electrical and rigging cleanliness are taken seriously. Problems are addressed early, when they are still small and cheap. That is the difference between "this thing never let me down" and "it ruined my summer." If you are buying one used, the outboard will tell you a lot if you know how to look. Clean, thoughtful rigging usually reflects thoughtful ownership. Service records matter more than polish. Sellers who can describe maintenance habits calmly and specifically are usually safer than sellers who lean entirely on reputation. Confidence is not evidence. Verado loyalty often comes from refinement plus strong support. The next pick earns trust through a different kind of calm, conservative design, steady behavior, and tolerance for real life. Some engines win loyalty by exciting people. Others win it by refusing to participate in the excitement at all. The Honda BF225 belongs firmly in the second group. Owners who swear by it rarely tell dramatic stories. They describe long stretches where nothing happens, no surprises, no personality shifts. Just steady behavior that fades into the background of ownership. The promise behind Honda in this space has always been conservative in the best sense of the word. Steady four-stroke power, built with an emphasis on smoothness, longevity, and margin rather than chasing the latest trend. That philosophy shows up not in brochures, but in how owners talk about these engines after years of use. Starts feel the same season after season. Idle stays calm instead of searching. Long runs do not feel like endurance tests for the motor. At this horsepower level, that matters more than people expect. Normal wear becomes expensive wear faster. A cooling issue that would be annoying on a smaller motor becomes a real problem when the outboard is responsible for the entire day's success. A fuel system issue is not just inconvenient when it appears far from the ramp. Owners who swear by this outboard family often point out that the issues they encountered were predictable and fixable, not confusing or cascading. There is also a subtle ownership advantage that does not get enough attention. Conservative platforms often tolerate imperfect human behavior better. Not neglect will kill anything but imperfect habits. A service that happens a little late, a season where the boat sits more than usual, a few runs in rough conditions. Engines built with margin tend to absorb real life better than engines that live close to their limits. That does not mean the outboard is immune. The same three slow predators still apply: heat, fuel, and corrosion. Ignore water pump service, and cooling passages will eventually restrict. Ignore fuel management, and even the calmest motor can start stumbling. Ignore corrosion prevention, and small electrical issues can creep in quietly. What owners appreciate is that these problems tend to announce themselves in understandable ways, rather than appearing as random failures. People who truly get the never breaks experience with this outboard are not lucky. They are methodical. They treat the motor like a system instead of an appliance. Fuel stays clean and dry. Cooling health is maintained proactively, rigging stays tidy, and corrosion is addressed early. And when something feels slightly off, they investigate instead of dismissing it. If you are shopping for one used, this is where subtlety matters. Look past shine. Look at how the outboard was integrated into the boat. Clean, sensible rigging usually indicates an owner who cared about the details. Ask how it was stored. Ask about fuel habits. Ask about cooling service. Sellers who can explain their routine without defensiveness usually reveal more than sellers who rely on the brand's reputation to do the talking. This outboard earns loyalty because it does not demand attention to feel safe. It does its work quietly, season after season, as long as it is treated with basic respect. And that is exactly why it sets up the next twist, because the next outboard on the list is not about big horsepower at all. It is about the motor that dealers trust when everything else starts to feel uncertain. If you've ever had a backup motor save your day or fail when you needed it, drop a comment with what happened. Those real stories matter more than spec sheets. And if this kind of grounded outboard talk is useful, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Tohatsu 9.8. It looks almost too ordinary to earn a place in a serious conversation. No imposing stance, no suggestion of excess. Just a compact machine that waits without asking for attention. And that quiet presence is exactly what gives it weight. A small, portable outboard is rarely celebrated while everything is going right. It earns its reputation later, when conditions shift and certainty starts to thin. Most of the time, a motor like this is treated like a background object. It rides along, gets moved around, maybe started once in a while, then forgotten again. That long silence becomes a kind of honesty test, not of the engine, but of the owner. Was it stored correctly? Was the fuel respected? Was it started often enough to stay awake? When the moment finally comes, the engine does not care about intentions. It responds only to preparation. The Tohatsu 9.8 has built its reputation in that exact space. It does not dominate discussions. It does not inspire arguments. It simply appears again and again in places where starting reliability matters more than everything else. Mechanics tend to recognize it immediately. Dealers mention it without enthusiasm, which is often the highest compliment. Owners who swear by it rarely sound emotional, they sound relieved. This is the kind of engine that becomes trusted not through excitement, but through absence. Absence of surprises, absence of rituals, absence of those small anxieties that creep in when you are unsure whether something will cooperate. When people describe why they trust it, they rarely talk about specifications. They talk about mornings when it started cold, afternoons when it sat idling for hours without complaint, days when it simply did what it was supposed to do. Its role matters more than its rating. A small outboard doing gentle work lives a different life than a large outboard pushing hard. Lower thermal load, fewer violent cycles, less demand per revolution. That difference compounds over time. It does not make the engine superior. It makes its job survivable. Longevity is often less about strength and more about restraint, and this engine's entire existence is built around restraint. Owners who rely on it tend to remember the same moment. Something with the main outboard does not feel right. Maybe it is not dramatic, just different enough to raise a question. The weather shifts. The distance home suddenly feels longer than it did an hour ago. The decision is made quietly. The small engine is lowered, started, and it settles into a steady rhythm. The boat moves, slowly, calmly. Control returns. That moment quietly reshapes how people think about reliability. It stops being about speed, ratings, or reputation and becomes about predictability. The engine does not need to impress or outperform anything. It needs to start, run, and keep the situation under control. That is why loyalty to these small motors can feel outsized compared to their size. They do more than move a boat forward. They create options. And having options changes outcomes when conditions stop cooperating. Simplicity, though, is not immunity. This motor can absolutely be ruined, and it usually happens in ordinary ways. Old fuel left sitting too long, cooling service ignored because it barely runs, storage that invites corrosion to work quietly over time. The difference is not that neglect has no cost, it is that the cost makes sense. When something goes wrong, there is usually a clear reason instead of a mystery. That clarity is part of the appeal. Problems tend to announce themselves plainly, and fixes are mechanical rather than theoretical. Owners who swear by this engine learned early that care matters. They ran it dry. They stored it properly. They started it often enough to keep it alive. Buying one used is less about shine and more about habits. How it was stored, how it was run, whether it was respected. That story matters more than appearance. That backup experience changes how people define dependable. With that perspective, returning to big horsepower feels different because the costs scale up and calm becomes the goal. Suzuki DF300. At 300 horsepower, the relationship between the boat and the motor changes. This is no longer a casual pairing, where a minor issue is shrugged off and handled later. At this level, the outboard defines the entire experience. It determines how confidently the boat carries weight, how calmly it behaves when conditions shift, and how expensive a bad decision becomes. A problem here is not just mechanical. It can turn into a repower debate, a resale shock, or a season that quietly slips away while the boat sits. That is why the Suzuki DF300 earns its reputation in a very specific way. Owners who swear by it rarely describe it as exciting. They describe it as steady, calm, willing to work, without constantly reminding you how hard it is working. For a motor in this class, that matters more than most people realize. Engines that feel stressed tend to live hot, and heat is what accelerates wear in ways that only show up years later. The promise behind this platform has always been strong torque paired with modern four-stroke manners. In real use, that promise translates into an outboard that pulls without theatrics. It carries heavy hulls without sounding angry. It holds crews without hunting. It does not constantly introduce new behaviors that make owners wonder if something is wrong. Many people who live with this motor describe it less like a performance outboard and more like a working engine built to do a job repeatedly, not to impress once. A major reason this reputation holds is practical rather than philosophical. This outboard family has a large enough installed base that its patterns are understood. That matters. Known issues are manageable issues. Cooling. Service intervals are known. Fuel sensitivity is understood. Wear points are familiar. When something goes wrong, it usually goes wrong in a way that experienced technicians recognize. The most painful engines are not always the ones that fail most often. They are the ones that fail in confusing ways, where every symptom leads to a different theory, and no solution ever feels final. Owners who swear by the Suzuki DF300 often talk about problems they did have, but the way they describe them is telling. They talk about maintenance, not mystery, a cooling system that needed attention, fuel cleanliness that had to be taken seriously, normal wear items that eventually did what wear items do. These are not horror stories, they are ownership stories. And at this horsepower level, that distinction matters. Still, the tension is always there, because high horsepower amplifies everything. A partially restricted cooling passage that would be tolerable at lower output can trigger protective behavior here. A marginal fuel delivery issue might only show up when the outboard is asked to work hardest, which is often the worst possible time. A sensor that drifts slightly out of range can suddenly turn into alarms, and reduced power far from the ramp. The outboard is not unbreakable. No outboard is. What owners are really saying when they swear by it is that the failure modes feel logical rather than random. That logic gives owners confidence, but it can also breed complacency. A motor that behaves well for years can tempt people into stretching service intervals or ignoring early signs. At 300 horsepower, that is where mistakes become expensive. The engines that stay legends tend to belong to owners who never confuse reliability with invincibility. They treat cooling service as mandatory. They treat fuel quality as a system, not an afterthought. They pay attention to small changes instead of waiting for big ones. If you are buying one used, this is where discipline matters. Service history is not paperwork, it is value. Clean rigging tells a story about how the outboard was treated day to day. Evidence of regular cooling service matters more than cosmetic shine. Fuel habits matter. Corrosion control matters. A well-kept motor in this class often looks boring in the best way. Nothing hacked. Nothing improvised, nothing hidden behind confidence. Lazy ownership at 300 horsepower is not forgiving. The costs scale up fast, and the consequences linger. But careful ownership is rewarded with something rare at this level: calm. The feeling that the outboard is not constantly on edge. The sense that the boat remains an asset rather than a liability. That is what owners are defending when they say they swear by it. 300 horsepower tests. Reliability through workload. The final pick tests it through perception, support, and history, an engine that people defend or doubt, with almost no middle ground. Evinrude E-Tec 200. This outboard always starts an argument, and that is precisely why it belongs at the end. The Evinrude E-Tec 200 sits at the intersection of loyalty and skepticism, praise and caution. Some owners talk about it like a cult classic. Others talk about it like a gamble. That tension is not noise. It is the story, because few engines reveal the truth about ownership more clearly than this one. The promise behind Evinrude E-Tec was bold from the beginning: direct injected 2-stroke efficiency, fewer scheduled service requirements, strong real-world torque, and lighter weight than many 4-stroke competitors. On paper, it challenged the direction the market was heading. In practice, it offered a very specific appeal. Owners who swear by these engines often talk about how alive their boats felt. Strong mid-range pull, immediate response, a sense that the motor was eager rather than reserved. When these engines are right, they can feel exceptional. That is why some owners defend them so passionately. In their hands, with proper care, the outboard ran for years without turning ownership into a constant maintenance ritual. It delivered performance they did not want to give up, and it did so with a personality that felt distinct in a sea of increasingly similar four-strokes. So why do opinions split so sharply? Because this platform rewards careful ownership and exposes careless ownership more than most. Fuel quality matters. Correct oiling practices matter. Cooling health matters. Software updates matter. Setup matters. When all of those pieces are handled correctly, the outboard can be remarkably dependable. When they are not, problems tend to show up quickly and decisively. The engines that become legends usually belong to owners who stayed ahead of small issues instead of reacting to big ones. They used the correct oil, they paid attention to injector health, they respected cooling service even when the outboard seemed happy. They addressed warnings as messages, not annoyances. In other words, they treated the motor like a high-performance system, not a forgiving appliance. There is also the reality that cannot be ignored: support. Dealer experience varies widely. Parts access and service familiarity can dramatically shape the ownership story. A mechanically strong outboard can still feel stressful if the ecosystem around it becomes thin. That is the part people rarely say outright, but you can hear it between the lines. When support is strong, confidence stays high. When support weakens, even a good motor can start to feel risky. That long shadow of brand history affects perception as much as mechanics do. Some owners feel insulated by their experience. Others feel exposed by theirs. Neither is lying. They simply lived different versions of the same platform. And that is what makes this outboard such a revealing closer. It forces the question, what does "never breaks down" actually mean? The grounded takeaway is not that this outboard is universally safe or universally risky. The takeaway is that reliability is not a single attribute. It is a relationship between engineering, maintenance habits, and support. Owners who swear by the Evinrude E-Tec 200 are not usually denying that it can have issues. They are saying that, in their hands, with the right care, it stayed strong and delivered a kind of performance they did not want to replace. That is the pattern this entire list points to. Big outboards create tension because the stakes are expensive and visible. Small outboards create surprise because simplicity can outperform expectations when used correctly. And engines like this one reveal the final truth. Reliability is not just about what you buy, it is about how you own it, who can support it, and how early you respond when the motor starts talking. If this list sharpened how you think about what owners swear by, hit like it helps more buyers hear what's usually unsaid. Subscribe for the next breakdown, where we flip the script on engines that disappoint later. And if you've got questions or experiences, drop them in the comments.